And many thanks to Father Randy, to David Atwood for the opportunity to do this. We started working on this several months ago, and David asked if we put together a Veterans Day service. First, can the veterans who are here stand? And I know we have lots of veterans in Emmanuel. In fact, I am always in awe. Thank you very much to the veterans and to the families. As so often said, it is not only the veteran who serves, but also the family who serves. So we have so many children, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, friends of veterans. So thank you very much for all you have given. And I'll start with a prayer. Dear Lord, today we honor our veterans, worthy men and women who gave their best when they were called upon to serve and protect their country. We pray that you will bless them for their unselfish service and the continuing struggle to preserve our freedoms, our safety, and our country's heritage for all of us. Bless them abundantly for the hardships they faced, for the sacrifices they made, for their many different contributions to America's victories over tyranny and oppression. We respect them, we thank them, and we honor them, and we are proud of them. We pray that you will watch over these special people and bless them with peace and happiness. Amen. This past week, I spent a couple of days at the Vietnam Memorial. This is the 40th anniversary of the Vietnam Wall, and we read the names of all of the fallen from the Vietnam War. With that, I'll get started. I would like to introduce our guest speaker today, dear friend, brother, fellow soldier, and mentor, Colonel, Chaplain, Dr. Charlie Reynolds. Charlie hails from Bedford, Virginia. Yes, that Bedford. He's a Virginian living in South Carolina. I'm the South Carolinian living in Virginia. But Charlie and I have been friends for a very long time. He hails from Bedford, Virginia. He's a graduate of the University of Richmond. He's a graduate of Princeton University with a master's in world religions and culture. He's also a graduate of Golden Gate Seminary. Chaplain Reynolds has a distinguished career in the military, having started in the California National Guard, served for 28 years, various assignments all over the world, to include with me in the mighty 18th Airborne Corps, and that's Army speak for a big unit at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Also served in the 10th Mountain, deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Sierra Leone, Macedonia, and Liberia. Also served as the chaplain for the Army Special Operations Command. So assignments all over the world. Has pastored churches in Austria, California, and in the United States. He has published several books, and it's amazing. Charlie and I spent yesterday together, and you think you know somebody, and you really don't. And we talked about all the things that he's done, publications and things that he's written. But his publications include a strategic plan for climbing the military mountain, and a book soon to be published, A Quest for a Warrior Priest, enlisting warriors as healers and peace builders, that will be released soon. There's so many aspects, and hopefully we'll get to this today. And I'd like this to be a dialogue, so if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to say so. We'll bring the mic to you. One of the interesting things that Charlie did was served as a liaison in Bosnia between the Serbs and the Catholics. So if you can talk about that, Charlie. Just a couple of funny stories, and I got to tell these. One is actually not as funny as I originally thought when I got the rest of the story, but as I mentioned before, Charlie and I were deployed to Baghdad in 2011 as we thought we were closing down Iraq. And Charlie was, okay, can you hear me? Is that better? Sorry, forgive me. Charlie was, we were on Victory Base in Baghdad. Charlie was at a religious affairs. Okay. A bunch of chaplains got together on Victory Base. So we were being mortared, and we had these shelters. And so there's Charlie, a Baptist minister. There's an imam, a priest, and a rabbi, and they all go out to the shelter. So the joke was, what does an imam, a priest, a rabbi, and a Baptist minister have in common? I don't know, but there's a sermon in here somewhere. The other, and I find this sort of funny. My job in the advisory role in the last days of Iraq was advising their Ministry of Communication. So a much more direct mission, maybe as difficult but easier to understand. Charlie was the advisor to the Ministry of Culture that had oversight of faith groups, to include Christian groups in Baghdad. And interestingly enough, it is the Christian, as Episcopalians you'll appreciate this, it's the Christians that run the liquor stores in Baghdad. Is that right, Charlie? Okay. So when there are no liquor stores, that is, in some sense, proof that other religious groups are not being allowed to exercise their faith.
Well, when they close the liquor stores, it means two things. Number one, they're enforcing Sharia law, which is illegal, okay? And number two, that's the financial lifeblood of the minorities and Christians. So they're shutting down their financial support. So
the joke was that we have a Baptist minister. So you saw this, and
well, what happened was I was briefing General Austin, and my contacts had told me they had closed all the liquor stores, and so I briefed General Austin. I briefed him once a week in what we call the battle update brief, and it's really strange because I'm sitting in this little cubicle in the American Embassy, but all the commanders in Afghanistan are listening. It's being broadcast at CENTCOM in Tampa, and notes are going to the White House, right? So you're just weird. You're in this little thing, cubicle. Nobody's around you, but the world's listening. So I reported to General Austin that they'd closed all the liquor stores. Well, normally when I gave my briefing, General Austin would say, "Thank you, Padre," and the next guy would brief. Well, this time he says, "Chaplain, you need to get your facts straight." Now, when the commanding general tells you that, that is not good, all right? He says, "Prime Minister Maliki has assured me that they only closed a few liquor stores that are conducting illegal activity, and they're trying to cut down on illegal activity." Then he called my boss in and said, "Why did you?" Because I did not know the Iraqis, because we were transitioning, the Iraqis were listening to the briefing. So I had contradicted to General Austin what Prime Minister Maliki had told him. He calls my boss in and said, "Why did you embarrass me like that?" And so I called my wife and said, "I might be home early." And it turned out I was correct. They had closed all the liquor stores. So every time a liquor store got threatened, they would call my office. And I would report it up. And so General Buchanan, who was my supervisor, who was a Lutheran, who loved to tease me about being a backwoods Baptist, we were having a reception at the American Embassy for a couple congressmen and other people that were visiting, and he says, "This is my Baptist chaplain that protects our liquor stores here in Baghdad."
But and as a side note, if you've ever been around General Austin, now Secretary of Defense Austin, if you want to hear the voice of God, it is General Austin. Okay. But what I wanted to do was talk about a unique aspect of faith, military chaplains, and I'll end with a story, and kind of a weird story. Thursday night, I got a call from a buddy, and he said, "Hey, do you want to go to the veterans breakfast at the White House?" And I was like, "Sure." So it's late on Thursday. They've got the list done. My name is not in any of the list. They assembled us on Fort Myer. We had to take a COVID test. We take a COVID test. We get on buses. The buses are just crowded. And because my name is on any list, I'm the last of everything. I get on the bus, and there are only 3 seats left. And I'm on the bus, and there's one seat, and there's a young woman, and her legs are on the hump, the wheel hump in the back of the bus. And I thought, well, she's probably going to want to, but at that point, it was the only seat left. So I sit down. Well, I sit down, and we started talking, and her sister was across from us on the other aisle. And you guys know I volunteer, most of you, at the Army Museum. At the Army Museum, there are these pedestals, and on one of the pedestals are soldier stories. And one of the stories is of Chaplain Emil Kapan. Chaplain Kapan was a Medal of Honor recipient from the Korean War. He had served in World War II in Burma. He volunteered to serve again during the Korean War. In almost exactly November of 1950, his unit was overrun by the Chinese. their higher command, this was 3rd of the 8th Infantry, ordered all of the able-bodied soldiers to leave, and Chaplain Capon refused to leave, and he stayed with the wounded and the injured soldiers, and he negotiated with a Chinese officer for the capture of the remaining Americans, and he stayed. And at one point, there was a North Korean who was attempting to execute an American soldier, and he put his arm around him and refused and did not allow him to be executed. For that, again, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. He is being considered for sainthood in the Catholic Church. But as I'm sitting there, and as I saw at the museum, and I wanted to tell that story, to talk about chaplains, the old rule in the Army is put your chaplains where your soldiers are most miserable. 20-mile ruck march, the airborne operation at 2 o'clock in the morning in Afghanistan and Iraq when we had losses. But as I'm sitting between these two sisters, they started telling me the story of the husband of one of the sisters who was stricken with stage 4 colon cancer. And they had been praying to Chaplain Capon every day for the past year. Now, God is not subtle with me. All right, so, I get this call, I'm on this bus, there's one seat left, and I'm sitting between these two sisters who are talking about Chaplain Capon. But Chaplain, when I asked them about what they prayed for, they said they prayed for hope, for inspiration, for wisdom, for strength, and the husband was healed. He was healed. And again, Chaplain Capon is being considered for sainthood in the Catholic Church. I don't know how many Medal of Honor recipients we have who are saints, but pretty incredible story, and pretty incredible that I ended up sitting between the two of them. But I say that to talk about just the strength of chaplains. When Charlie and I were talking last night, we were talking about where chaplains are, and we talked about, ruck marches, and you're tired and you're hungry, and just can be pretty miserable. But how, as a chaplain, his presence was a presence of God, and soldiers knowing that. So with that, I will turn it over to Chaplain Charlie.
I got it, Mike.
Okay.
Which is a very humbling experience, one that I'm certainly not worthy of, but an honor that God called me to. So it's a real honor to be with you today. I've heard so many good things about this church from Keith that it's a real blessing to be here with you. And what a blessing you have to have Keith in your congregation. I first met Keith at the 18th Airborne Corps, where we jumped out of airplanes together. But I held a class called Exploring Religion, because so many chaplains have soldiers from every faith group, but they maybe took a class in world religions in seminary, they may not have. So they really know very little about the religions of their soldiers, and so offered this class as a way of, we take a different religion each week and explore it. But I opened it up to anybody that wanted to come, and Keith shows up, and I thought, gee, I wonder why the signal guy's here. What I didn't know is Keith is what I call a connoisseur of religion. He loves discussing religion. And we started a discussion in that class that has lasted over 10 years. And he is one of my cherished friends. And so it's just great to, when he asked me to come, I couldn't say no. But I want to start by sharing one story, and then I think the best way to do a forum is open up to questions. I'll start with that story, then I'll share a little bit about how I got into peace building, and then we'll open it up to you. But it was November the 3rd, 2006. I was in my office at Fire Base Salerno, or Forward Operation Base Salerno, which is near Khost, Afghanistan. And I received a phone call from Phil Wright, who was my chaplain supervisor. He said, Chaplain, to Charlie, he said, there is a Black Hawk en route to pick you up to take you to the Korengal Valley. Now, I had never been to the Korengal Valley, but everybody in Afghanistan had heard about the Korengal Valley. They had had more KIAs than any company in theater. And it was a very hot area in terms of, when I mean hot, I'm not talking about temperature, okay? He said they have lost their medic. He was killed yesterday, and they need you to go out and do the memorial ceremony. When I landed in the Korengal, I thought I was in a Vietnam movie. There was shrapnel everywhere from where rockets had exploded. Those guys, most of us had showers we could go to and take showers. These guys had a cloth bag with a filter on it, and they would fill it up with water, let it heat up, and then open the filter and let the water trickle down. And that's the way they took a shower. Most of us took our laundry to a drop-off place, and locals would do our laundry, fold it, and send it back to us. They did their laundry on a washboard and hung it on a clothesline to dry. I mean, these guys were tip of the spear, and my heart just bonded with these guys and the conditions they were under and the losses they were experiencing. I think they'd already lost about 8 or 10 soldiers of their company when I got there, when they lost their medic. And so I spent the next couple days counseling with these guys. The medic, Specialist Anthony Vaccaro, was the most loved person in that company. And when he died, it was just devastating for them. And so the next day we were having the memorial ceremony. And their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Chris Cavoli, who's now Lieutenant General. He and his wife didn't have kids. His soldiers were his kids. And whenever they had a memorial service, he would stand beside the display. I think you've probably seen the display at every military memorial ceremony. You have the soldier's weapon, his helmet, the dog tags, and his boots. And at the very last thing in the ceremony is each soldier comes up and does a final salute to their comrade. And Colonel Cavoli would always stand beside the display to be there to give his soldiers a word of encouragement, as they left. He was on leave. And so I said to Jim McKnight, the company commander, I said, Jim, this is a part of their ritual. It would be good for somebody to stand there. And I was hoping Jim would say, I'll do it. But he said, Chaplain, why don't you do it? Which I think was a God thing. There are 2 places infantry soldiers can cry. They can cry alone, and they can cry in the chaplain's office. And so when the first soldier did his final salute, he walked over and I reached out my hand to him because I was standing there. And instead of taking my hand, he buried his head in my chest. Sorry. And our tears mingled. And something happened that had not happened in my 40 years of ministry. It was not Charlie Reynolds who was standing there, but it was the arms of Jesus holding those soldiers. And every soldier in that company except one cried in my arms that day. So when I think of Veterans Day and Memorial Day, that's what I think of. And what a privilege it was to be Christ's presence, to be God's presence among soldiers was just a terrible honor. And I'm sorry, I'm an emotional person, so anyway. But I'll tell you how I got into peace building. It was, I had a professor in college that said we probably stumble into God's middle world, then we walk into it. And I've also learned that God loves to work outside of the boxes that we try to confine him to. But I actually got into peace building in a training exercise in Hohenfels, Germany. Before you go to, before you're deployed, you have to go through a certification exercise that simulates what you're going to be involved with when you get there. And so we were in our training exercise, and we were preparing to go to Bosnia. We had a kinetic, war-fighting exercise because they had to know we were ready to fight. But then we went into the peace-building stage, and my commander was supposed to be negotiating a peace with the groups, and it was not going well. And I knew my commander, and I knew he was getting ready to lose his temper. And I knew if he lost his temper, it was not going to be good. That things were going to go ugly, all right? And so I took out my notebook, and I wrote a note. I said, "Sir, take a break." And I passed it to him. And he looks at it, and he takes a break. And we go out to the break. He says, "Chaplain, what'd you pass me that note for?" And I said, "Sir, they're intentionally trying to get you to lose your temper. And if you do that, this is not going to go well. You need to just relax, calm down, just be a little more patient, and things will work out." And that's what happened. So when we got to Bosnia, my commander says, "Chaplain, you're going to be my liaison to the Serbian Orthodox priest, the Catholic Croatian priest, and the Muslim imam in the city of Brčko, which was one of the hot cities in the ZAS, the zone of separation. It was one of the cities that was just almost totally destroyed." And so then when I finished that, what you find is that one of the bad things that religion can do is religion can cause people to overcome cognitive dissonance. And what I mean by that, there are certain things that people innately know are wrong to do to other human beings. But if they can be convinced that it's God's will for them to do those things, then that overcomes the cognitive dissonance. And that's exactly what happened in Bosnia. But what I found is that religious leaders have a lot of influence. They have some influence in their country, but in most countries they have even more influence over the populace. And if you can get those religious leaders together, and if they can begin to see that person who they have labeled as the other, and basically, before you can do horrible things to people, you have to dehumanize them, okay? Which is what was done with African Americans in the United States. And so that's what it, well, if you can get those people together and they can begin to see those religious leaders as other human beings, then that can change their perception, and that then can influence their congregations and can affect the entire region. And so that's what we did in Bosnia. And I guess I was somewhat successful at it. The Army decided to send me to Princeton to get a degree in world religions and culture. Later sent me to George Mason to study peace building. And so I spent a lot of my career, I spent a lot of it as doing regular chaplain things, but I also was given assignments where I would, like in Iraq, where my main job was meeting with religious leaders. And I met with the Mandeans, the Yazidis, a lot of those groups that were killed by ISIS, because the ISIS took over that region where a lot of the minorities were, and all the religious, Jewish group. There was a Jewish population in Baghdad that we had to get out of Baghdad because the WikiLeaks leak gave their addresses and their aliases. And we had to move them out, and I was the only one who knew where they were, and or how to contact them, and so so I met with all the different minority groups and tried to do peace building. So anyway, that gives you a little bit of my background. Let's see, there were. So I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. So.
Yeah, and please, I'd like this to be a dialogue. So if you've got a comment or question, please feel free.
Oh, by the way, before you go, who's good at timekeeping? Okay, you'll be my timekeeper. There's a story I want to share for the last 10 minutes. So it'll be at 10. Keith, what time? What?
I'll let David tell us when we want.
So 10 to 1. You'll let me know when it's 1:45.
I'll let you know.
Okay, and then because I want to share a closing story. So.
Yeah, I served with the 25th Infantry in Vietnam, and I never saw any chaplains. And at that point in my life, it was probably when I was least Christian. Mm-hmm. My father graduated from the seminary, and I never could understand. When you say you in a peace serving mode, I thought that chaplains only did the immediate, duties like you mentioned, out in the field, and when soldiers when a unit was wiped out and things like that. But and from your experience and all, it looked like religion existed amongst your enemies and everything. But that's why I guess I don't know much about the chaplain's role in Vietnam when your enemy was non-religious, was communist.
Yeah.
And what kind of role did chaplains play any role at all in the peacekeeping process there?
First of all, I apologize to you that you didn't have a chaplain that ever saw you. Some chaplain didn't do his job, okay? When I was battalion chaplain, I saw every one of my soldiers every week. Mm-hmm. Now in Vietnam, you can't see them every week, and once you in the Army, once you become a major, then you're supervising other chaplains. And in Afghanistan, I was supervising 15 chaplains, and I made sure that my goal was to see them once a month. I couldn't do that. But anyway, my point is, you should have seen a chaplain. Yeah. And I'm sorry that happened. But there's some good, you know, like any other vacation, there's some good chaplains and bad chaplains. It may have been a chaplain tried to get to you and couldn't. You know, that's quite possible. But I actually went back to the Corngall for Christmas of 2006. I was talking about chaplains not doing their job. We had a chaplain. I supervised the 15 chaplains. There was another chaplain, that was aviation chaplain, who I didn't supervise, but he was co-located with me because he worked with aviation, and we had a airfield there.
Right.
And he was getting ready to go home and retire, and he made a deal with his commander that he wouldn't go outside of the wire anymore, meaning he wouldn't go where it's dangerous. And it really pissed me off.
Right.
Because to me, if you're not willing to go out of the wire, get out of the Army. All right? You know? Yeah. So Christmas was coming. This was my headquarters, my commander, my soldiers. You know, and I'm saying, okay, I've got 35 locations spread over 25,000 square miles. I can't have 2 chaplains in one location on Christmas, okay? And I decided he's going to have to go somewhere, right?
Right.
And then I said, okay, I need to pray about it, all right? And so I prayed about it, and I asked, where would Jesus go? And I knew I was going to the Cornwall because I had been there for the memorial service, and I knew that those were the guys that needed Christmas.
Yeah.
So I called, you know, so my chaplain had a 6'4" former heavyweight boxer chaplain. So I said, Sergeant Garrett, you want to go to Cornwall for Christmas? He goes, who is, sir? And, you know, when God gives you a mission, he provides. I didn't really ask for anything, but I had so much stuff to take to the Cornwall, they had to get a Chinook helicopter to carry it all. I had 5 huge boxes of gifts called Blue Star Mothers. I had ridden on an airplane with the sports medicine director from Syracuse University when I took my leave to go home. He sent me 3 cases of Syracuse University sports equipment, sports gear, okay? I had a phone card for every soldier in that company to call home on Christmas Day. I had cookies from a Catholic youth group, and usually when we got the cookies, they were all crumbled, and I guess they'd heard about that. So they had taken these cookies fresh out of the oven, sealed them in baggies, so when you open the baggies,
Yeah.
and they wrapped them in bubble wrap so they weren't broken. And if there's anybody that deserved those cookies, it was those guys in the Cornwall. And so should I tell the mortar story? You just forget I'm a Baptist when I tell this story, right? So, but anyway, we were that Christmas Eve. I was doing the Christmas Eve service. We were behind HESCO barriers, and we were lighting candles, doing Silent Night. And all of a sudden, I've got this on video, by the way. There's this boom, and it was a mortar, and all the candles just go. You know, and the sergeant major steps out from behind the HESCO barriers, and he shouts down the Cornwall Valley. He says, "You bastards aren't going to ruin our Christmas." And he steps back in, and he goes, "Light them back up, gentlemen." But anyway, so we had the Christmas service. We went and had that meal, and those guys, their meal, by the way, they had one hot meal a day, which was tea rations, which is heated up food in metal containers. It's not that great.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. They never got fresh food. They had flown in fresh meal from Bagram for them to have for Christmas. So that we had this Christmas service, we had that meal, and then I took all those presents I had. I had enough presents for every soldier to get one present. So we did a lottery. I gave every soldier a number, and the presents we call number 1. I said, if you want to trade, you can, but that's the only way we can give out the presents. So we did that. And then as we were walking out, one of the soldiers came up to me, Specialist Wilson, and he said, "Chaplain, I thought this was going to be a pretty lousy Christmas, but it turned out pretty good." And that was his last Christmas. Yeah, he was killed 3 months later. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, hey, Charlie, just a couple of things. One, I think that's a great lead-in. Charlie let me read his book that's going to be out in a couple of weeks, months, about warrior priests, and I thought I understood what chaplains did, having chaplains when I was a battalion commander, brigade commander. But after reading your book, I realized, I was like, you know what? I didn't fully understood all the things that chaplains do. And if you could talk about that, and also talk about, the Army is a reflection of our nation. So you get soldiers from all faith groups, Jewish soldiers, Muslim soldiers, non-believers, atheists. to be able to serve such a very diverse community?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you start out as a captain and you're a battalion chaplain. And your primary job as a chaplain in the military is to provide for the free exercise of religion of all your soldiers, regardless of what their religion is or their belief is. That's your primary responsibility. Now, you also lead services, but only for your faith group. So I only led services for Protestant soldiers. However, I was responsible to see, in Afghanistan, I had 3 Catholic priests, but I had to bring in an imam, and I had to bring in a Orthodox priest, and I had to bring in a Jewish rabbi. And by the way, they weren't there long enough to go to 32 locations. So I put them in 4 main areas because they were only there for a week, so that I could only get them to 4 places in a week. And I had to coordinate with all the commanders, so I had to start 3 months out and coordinate with all the commanders to be able to get their soldiers from that faith group to those 4 locations. So it was not logistically easy to accomplish. And then I had to cover those 35 locations. And I was supposed to have a Protestant service every 30 days and a Catholic priest every 60 days. I got 1 helicopter a week that could go to 3 locations in proximity. All right? And that was if they didn't need that helicopter for a mission they considered more important, or if the weather was good. Okay? So I usually got about 2 helicopters a month. All right? So every night at 8 o'clock, the flight list would be published for the following day. And I'm immediately on the phone trying to get seats on a bird, fighting with everybody else that wants to get people on a bird to get my chaplains out to where that we need to go, and then constantly tracking. So, and also when you do, it's not just doing services. And like anytime you have a battle plan. And you have to work your religious support plan into that battle plan, because you can't just show up and say, let's have church. That doesn't work, all right? You've got to look at what's happening in the battle and who's going to take the casualties, okay? And how can you get the chaplain to where he needs to be ahead of time so that when those casualties occur, he will be in place. So all that takes coordination. And so it's not just I'm preaching on Sunday. it's a logistical challenge as well. And then a challenge of accommodating for different faith groups. And some chaplains are very good at that, some are not. I remember going to one of my Buddhist chaplains and saying, is there anything? Buddhists normally provide for themselves pretty much. Okay, and I knew that, but I still went to him and said, is there anything I can get you that you need for religious support? He says, Chaplain, I'm fine, but thank you for asking. I've never had a chaplain ask me that before. And there was a court case in 1987 challenging the legitimacy of the chaplain corps, saying that it was government-sponsored religion. And the only reason we won that case is because the First Amendment, in addition to also says that you have the right to free exercise of religion. And in some of the places that military soldiers go, there's nobody else to provide that service except chaplains. So that's what saved the chaplain corps. And so that's why it's very important that chaplains recognize that this is their primary responsibility. So, yes.
I wish I knew you then. I served at the Pentagon, and as Valentine's Day approached, I thought it would be so nice to distribute chocolates especially to soldiers not receiving mail.
Yeah.
So I contacted different chocolate factories and requested, and everybody was ready to support.
Right.
So I had all these boxes going that way, but I didn't have a contact there. So, and I was hoping for the best. I was hoping the next day would get reports like, this really worked well. On the contrary, I was reading a report that unidentified boxes were blown up.
Oh, jeez. Oh, jeez.
Dead chocolate everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the, I love serving the United States military. I love serving my country. One of the things about the military is it is a huge bureaucracy. And many times in huge bureaucracies, things like that happen. And it's sad, you know, and sometimes the soldiers are victims of that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I always saw one of my primary jobs as a chaplain was to fight for the soldiers when they were wronged by that bureaucracy. Because I don't think it's intentional, okay? Maybe it is at times, but sometimes because it's a bureaucracy, families and soldiers get taken advantage of and get put in circumstances that are unjust. And so as a chaplain, I loved fighting. I loved fighting those battles. So anyway, I had one chaplain who, as a chaplain, if you get garrison assignments only, you're not going to advance because you have to have combat arms experience. And I had one really good chaplain who was new, and his sect had 2 garrison assignments, and I knew he was going to kill his career. So I called the personnel people and I said, you know, why is this guy having 2 garrison assignments? You know, and by the way, he was an NCO who was sapper tabbed. You know, he was military. He was a stellar soldier. And I said, why isn't he in an engineer unit? You know, so a month later they called me and said, we have an opening for a chaplain in an engineer unit. And I said, well, are you going to put him there? Because I don't want to go tell him he's going to engineer unit and then you change your mind. And they said, well, you better wait. And so I waited. They called me about a week later and said, okay, he's for sure going there. So I went over and told him. He gets all excited. They called me the next morning. We changed our mind. Well, I said, why? And they said, well, the chaplain that was supposed to replace him has a family member that can't deploy to Europe. And so we can't send, you know, I said, but the engineer unit is still open. They said, yeah, but we changed our mind. Well, I was really upset. Well, I knew they may have already cut the orders. A chaplain can't, a soldier can't contact their oncoming unit till they have orders to go there. So I knew the lady that cut the orders, and I knew that they might have his request for orders. She might have his request for orders. So I called. I said, "Do you have it?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Could you send it to me?" And she said, "Yes, I'll send it to you right now." They hadn't talked to her, and so she sent me. I went over, had his orders cut. And I said, go call your commander. And I said, make sure you tell him you're sapper tab. Because I knew when the commander found out he had a sapper tab chaplain, he wasn't going to give him up. Yeah. And so I was fighting the system, the bureaucracy. Because they were taking advantage of this guy, you know.
You were fighting for.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I would fight for the people that the bureaucracy was running over. That was my job.
Are some of the chaplains women? I haven't heard any mention yet.
Yes. Now, some denominations will not. Let me explain the endorsement process, which I'm the endorser for Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Before you can be a chaplain in the military says, as a chaplain, you're representing a particular faith group. And the military says, we are not qualified to determine whether this chaplain can represent a faith group. So before you can apply to the military to be a chaplain, you have to be endorsed by a recognized religious faith group that says this person is qualified to be a chaplain and represent our faith group. So that's my job as endorser, is to recruit chaplains, and we have an endorsement council that looks over, they write their theology, they write their bio, we look at their packet and say yes, they represent us, then they can go and apply to be a chaplain. But if you lose that endorsement, then you're out of the military. And now what was your question? Come back to that. Yeah, and so some denominations do not endorse women, some of the more conservative denominations. But Cooperative Baptist, we do, and there are military, some of the finest chaplains I've worked with were women chaplains. Donna Weddle, one of my division chaplains, was just a superb chaplain. And she was one who definitely fought the bureaucracy. They were trying to change my assignment one time, and she knew it was sort of vindictive, and she stepped in and defended me. And maybe that's part of why I took on that role for other chaplains.
Yeah, this is being live streamed, so I will try to get the mic to everybody to ask a question. And just along those lines, just 2 things. One is, how many denominations or faith groups does the Army recognize?
When I was in, there were about, I believe, there were around 187. Now they have over 200. Yeah, they've added a lot more groups now. And something they do now that they didn't do before. Before, soldiers had to put one of those recognized religions on their dog tags. Okay? Now they'll let soldiers put whatever they want on their dog tags. So then we have Jedi Knights. We, you know, we have, but it really makes it hard for the chaplain when he's going to do the memorial ceremony. You know, how do you do a memorial ceremony for a Jedi Knight? You know, so anyway. But,
Yeah, and just a couple more questions in case anybody else has other questions. But one is when we were going into Iraq in 2003, in the unit I was in, we didn't spend a lot of time, but we talked about Shias and Sunnis. And I know you, at that time, you were the chaplain for Army Special Ops. I think you guys spent more time. But I think that really demonstrates sort of the power of understanding faith groups.
when this was a Special Forces unit, which was the first unit in Baghdad during the war, when we did the invasion of Iraq, and the commander, you know, realized that there's Sunnis and Shias, and I don't know a thing about either one of them, and so he calls his chaplain in, and he says, "Chaplain, I want you to give me a briefing in 48 hours, less than 48 hours, on the difference between Shia and Sunni." Well, the chaplain didn't know anything about Shia and Sunni, okay, but he calls Chaplain Berry, who was his supervisor back at Fort Bragg, and said, "Help." And Chaplain Berry didn't know the difference between Shia and Sunni, so he calls me because when the Army pays for your education, then they give you a follow-on assignment. So when they sent me to Princeton, my follow-on assignment was to teach world religions and cross-cultural interaction to Special Forces. And so I was at SWIC doing it as an instructor. Chaplain Berry knew me, and so he called me, and so I was like 4:30 in the evening. I just called my wife and said I won't be home tonight, and stayed and put together a briefing on the difference between Shia and Sunni. I emailed it to Chaplain Berry. Chaplain Berry emailed it to his chaplain, and the chaplain briefed his commander. So that was fun to be a part of. So.
Just quickly, I'm a former Army civilian. Did you ever serve Air Force or other?
I do now. Okay. I did as a chaplain. I was when we had joint exercises. In fact, I was a senior chaplain in Liberia for the Ebola crisis. And normally, when you're a senior chaplain, you're supervising a bunch of chaplains. I was the only chaplain because we only had 500 and some soldiers there, but they were I had Seabees, I had Air Force, I had Army, I had Marines, and so I was the only chaplain there, so I did service for all of them. So you adapt to your role. And by the way, when I first got to Liberia, my General Darrell Williams, who was my boss, called me and he said, "Chaplain, I know you're supposed to just serve as soldiers, but the embassy, the morale is really hurting, and I need you to spend some time in the embassy." And so I became really a chaplain for the embassy, plus all the CBs and everybody there, really. So you adapt to different roles. It is different. The Army chaplains are more out where soldiers are. Okay, the Air Force is more like a pastor. They stay at the chapel because you can't fly around in airplanes all the time. So and they fly occasionally, but so they stay in the chapel and the airmen come to them, and it's more like being a pastor. The Navy, there's one chaplain on each ship, okay, and he really has to be really he's it, all right. And then the Marines are more like the Army. The Navy chaplains cover the Marines, and they're out there where the Marines are. And so there are some differences.
Yeah, would you talk a little bit about, and you let me read the book before it's been published, but you talk a lot about warrior priest.
Yeah. Again, I stumbled into God's will. I was asked by a close friend to write a book he wanted to develop a strategic plan for evangelism in the military. And I didn't see myself as evangelism as my primary role. My role, was a peace builder. But I love this man so much I couldn't tell him no. And then I hung up the phone like, what am I going to write? And for about 2 months I had brain cramp. And then all of a sudden I began to realize how much peace building is like evangelism. You are healing relationships with people and God and relationships between people and people. And that's what evangelism is, But it sort of gave me a different nuance of how to explain evangelism. And so, in the military right now, evangelism is a bad word, all right? Because you can't proselytize in the military because proselytizing can get volatile, and you can't have that. And military people do not distinguish between evangelism and proselytizing. They see them as one and the same. So I didn't want to use the word evangelism, and so I used the word recruitment, because everybody loves recruitment. Right? And then if I said we're recruiting Christians, that doesn't sound good either. And so I said we're recruiting warrior priests. And then I don't have time to explain and define what a warrior priest is, but in the book I spend a lot of times defining the role. Basically, I'm talking about what justifies war, okay? And there are evil persons who will take advantage of the innocent and destroy good if they're not stopped. And there have to be warriors to stop those people. But then there has to be those who come in and bring the healing and the reconciliation. And that's the job of the warrior priest. And so this book is about bringing healing and redemption to those who are called to do that in God's world. And so that's what my book is. And I'm in two organizations. I'm in this Christian think tank that is trying to develop this strategy, and I'm probably the most liberal person in that group. And then I'm at George Mason University. After I studied peace building there, Mark Gopin, you may have heard of Mark, is the director of the Center for World Religions and Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution. And Mark asked me to be a fellow in their group, and my assignment there was to try to heal the rift in America right now. And so I actually used this book. I made a statement in the introduction. I said, and Mark said, there's two reasons we need you in the group, Charlie. First, you're the only one that talks about God. And he said, secondly, you're the only one that has any contacts with conservative people. And so I wrote in the introduction of my book, I said, most of my liberal friends are so repulsed by the verbiage and actions of some conservatives that they can't see the God in any of them. And some of my conservative friends are so repulsed by the verbiage and actions of some liberals that they can't see the God in any of them. And we have to be able to see the God in each other. And what you do in peace building is you find common ground between the groups. And I said, I believe the common ground right now between liberal Christians and conservative Christians is we all want to share God's love with those around us. And that's what this book is about. And so part of the goal of this book is to try to help America recognize, in spite of how much the verbiage and actions of some people may repulse us, we have to be able to see the God in everyone. And in my book, I deliberately share stories of my interaction with very conservative people and my interactions with very liberal people to try to show the God in all of them. So, anyway.
That's why my war was so different.
Yeah.
Because number one, we had Buddhists, who are the most peace-loving religions in the world.
Yeah.
And then we had enemies who had no religion.
Yeah.
The true communists, the North Vietnamese,
Yeah.
and then, like you said, within our own army, we had the diverse groups and all. So I've never been able to reconcile the Vietnam War with, I see our Middle East wars and stuff as religious wars. I mean, like you said, you got Shiites against Sunnis and all of that, but they were all very religious people. And yet the Buddhists were so peaceful and all, and it's pretty much an individual, I guess. I can't speak for Buddhists, and then we had the true communists. So, it's like we were in a non-religious concept war.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of things about the Vietnam that are hard to reconcile. I think one of the hardest from the United States perspective is when Keith and I came back from Iraq, we had the blessing of the American people. And they said, thank you for your service. You guys got spit on. And that was wrong, because one of the most important dimensions of healing is the blessing of the community. And I'm so glad I read because this is the anniversary of the wall, I read an article recently about the guy, anybody remember the name of the architect of the wall? And he said, one of the things I'm most proud of is I believe this memorial helped people to change their attitude toward the Vietnam soldiers, which carried into the honor that Keith and I received that you didn't get. And I hope that you feel that because you deserve it. Yeah. You know, and here's something else. Let me do that. I'll close with two more stories. I always wondered when I pulled the trigger, you know, because, you know, I don't know, the Civil War only, like something like 40% of the soldiers never shot at the enemy, you know, and I always wondered, would I actually shoot to kill? Well, when I was in the RPG attack, if I had a weapon, I'd have shot to kill. And that really helped me to understand that war is not murder. War is taking care of your buddy and getting home to your family. If you don't kill them, they're going to kill you. And war, that makes the decision to go to war that much more critical. And one of the responsibilities of and that's why I define what constitutes a warrior priest. What is a warrior priest allowed to do and not allowed to do? And when a commander is doing something that is not what ethically correct, it is the responsibility of a chaplain to confront them. And I struggled with taking the oath of office when I became a chaplain, because I called the state chaplain of California who recruited me in the California National Guard, and I said, I don't know if I can take this oath or not, because it says I'm supposed to obey the President of the United States. Suppose the President of the United States asked me to do something that I can't morally feel like I could do. And he says, Charlie, I'm glad you're struggling with this, because part of your role as a chaplain is to be a moral conscience. Now, he said, if you yell foul every month, you're not going to last long in the Army. But once or twice in your career, you may have to speak out. And there were 2 times when I confronted leaders on moral issues. Yeah. So anyway. Okay. Yeah. Let me just sort of. I want to close with this story. Let me get a swallow of water. There were 3 times that I really felt God's unique presence. One I share with you in the Cornwall. One was in Liberia, which I don't have time for all 3, but the third one is the one I want to share. Anybody heard of Andrew White? He's known as Vicar of Baghdad. Okay. He's an Anglican priest who was sent to Baghdad just as a routine assignment. He was supposed to be there for 3 years. The war broke out, and he started ministering to the populace of Baghdad, not just Christians, but everybody, Muslims. He opened his church up. It became a clinic. Just an amazing man. I got to know Andrew. Andrew invited me to preach at his church in downtown Baghdad, which, by the way, is right next to the church where the priest had been killed by the suicide bomber. And I was pretty sure that the Army was not going to let me go. Because when I was supposed to meet with Ayatollah Sistani's deputy, it was cheaper to have us fly to London to meet than to give me security to go to Najaf. Right? So I said, the Army is not going to pay for me to go preach in downtown Baghdad, but I wanted to go. And so I went to General Buchanan, and I said, Andrew invited me to preach in his church, and he looked at me and says, Chaplain, you have to go. And what happened was, Christians were being persecuted. Congress was putting a lot of pressure on the military to do something about it. And he said, Chaplain, you have to go let those Christians know that we care about them and the suffering that they're going through. And by the way, when I got to the church, there were a lot more women than men, because so many of the men had been killed. And so I got to the church, and I, by the way, had a 22-man security detail, and they were not Army. They were the Blackwater, the professionals. When we get to the church, the head of the security detail comes up to me and he says, Chaplain, I don't know if you're one of those preachers that walks around when you speak, but you're not going to do that today. He said, you're going to stay in the front part of the church. Don't you be walking around anywhere. And so we had a normal service like you had, and they went to do the passing of the peace. And Andrew said, would you like to participate? And I thought, well, I could just do a couple people on the front row and, go back to my area. And so I went down, and he said, well, listen, in our culture, they're going to fold their hands like they're praying. And you're going to cup your hands over top of their hands, and you're going to say, Salam Messiah. And you are literally giving them a blessing. You're imparting God's presence to them. And so I went down to a couple of people in the front row, and I gave the blessing. I turned to go back, and Andrew had gone to the other side of the church. And they were holding their hands out. And I couldn't turn around. And as I gave that blessing, I could literally feel God's power coming through me to them. And it was just, I was in tears, they were in tears. It was just a powerful God moment. And, you know, that was what I was there for. I knew we were going to leave. We weren't going to do a thing for them. All I could do was bless them. And when I preached on the stoning of Stephen. Because like I said, I knew we were leaving, and I knew they were going to continue to suffer. And I had asked the question, when did Paul first encounter Christ? And most people say on the Damascus Road, but I don't think that's true. I think when Paul saw Stephen's face, and he saw the peace that Stephen had that he didn't have, he was looking at the face of Christ. And I said to them, in your suffering, the world can see the face of Christ. And so we get back to the American Embassy, and we get there, and my security, head of my security, he comes up to me, and he was sort of apologetic. He says, Chaplain, I started to stop you, which was what he was trained to do, okay? The fact that he didn't do that meant he went against all the training he had been given. And he said, he gave me his disclaimer. He said, I really didn't see anybody that looked dangerous. And then he told me his real reason. He said, something just stopped me. And that was the hand of God. And the next day I'm in my office, and this girl comes in. She says, Chaplain, I don't know if you know this or not, but the head of your security detail is an atheist. But he came back last night and told us there was something in that service he had never experienced before. Yeah. And it was it was God's presence in that service. And so I'll close this forum with the words with the sentence I closed my book with, that every breath that we take is an opportunity for God's healing presence to forgive and to bring healing to our lives, to bring forgiveness and healing to our lives. And every breath that we breathe out is an opportunity for God to use our lives to bring healing and redemption to his world. So.
That concludes the forum. Father Randy, do you have anything?
I want to say thank you.